Good afternoon, and welcome to the Nantucket Book Festival and this afternoon's panel discussion with our fiction writers. We're delighted to have you here. We're thrilled with the audiences that are coming to our events today, and so happy because you're the lifeblood of this festival and the reason that it exists. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for the committee and all the volunteers who are helping us here. We also want to give a big thank you to our major sponsors, Jill and Steve Karp and Nantucket Island Resorts, the Nantucket Historical Association, the Dreamland Theater, the Nantucket Athenaeum, WCAI, N Magazine, the Inquirer and Mirror, Wendy Schmidt, and the Haft Foundation, whose contributions allow us to make the vast majority of our events free and open to the public. And that is something that we've desired and tried hard to keep, and hope we will continue well into the future. The authors will all be in the alcove over here signing, where their books will be on sale after the event. We also encourage you to fill out comment cards that the volunteers have, and give us your email address if you would, so that we can keep in touch with you and let you know what we're about during the rest of the year. We also would be happy if you'd be willing to make a small contribution or a pledge to help the cause. I think that's about all I have to say. I'm going to turn it over now to Jill Karp, who will do further introductions. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I'm Jill, and I'm happy to welcome you all here to the Athenaeum and more of our fabulous literary weekend. I'm not going to stand here and talk because you didn't come here to hear me. I'm here to introduce to you one of our favorite interviewers on island, Kate Brosnan, my buddy, and she is going to introduce you to the panel up here. So enjoy your day. Don't forget your comments, all really good, right? Thank you.
This is so fun. Well, I'm Kate Brosnan, and I am so excited to be sitting here with three amazing female authors. I love the female voice. I am a reader, and so I'm really, really, really excited. Alice, I know, and I call her my friend. So when I was doing some research, I really looked into a lot of the things that you say about writing, because I think, first of all, you should buy all of their books because they're all wonderful and I've read them. Talking about truth. So, Samantha, you had a quote that said, fiction tells the real truth. And this is Samantha Hunt. Samantha, can you talk about what you think truth is in fiction?
Sure. A lot of my project with writing is thinking about the idea of truth and expanding that idea of truth, because I do find that when we say, reality, that my reality is often very different than that, and I've been aware of that since I was a little girl, and so I've always been writing towards that and thinking, like, what about the reality of a new mother? What about the reality of a marginalized person, a marginalized voice? And that's a very different reality. And so I part of that became an idea of thinking about super and natural, right? And so I think about the natural as a spectrum. I wrote a book about Nikola Tesla, and he's a scientist, but he was super, and a lot of his ideas were beyond any reality that we had imagined before he imagined it, right? And the next book is about people talking to the dead. And so thinking about ideas of that reality of, well, I carry my dead with me all the time, and, you know, maybe I don't speak with the dead, as in like, I hear voices, but I do speak with the dead all of the time. And so I see it all as a spectrum, this idea of truth. I'm also married to a journalist who told my daughters, Mom tells lies and I tell the truth. So, I had to combat that early.
Catherine Lacey, the quote that I found that I thought was really interesting about your work is you said, "It's our job as awake humans, not just writers, to consider ugly, uncomfortable, and beautiful, terrifying things." Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I guess that interview, I think I remember, it was about the first book, which was often my first book is called Nobody Is Ever Missing, and it's about a woman wandering through New Zealand, and it's all in her head. Pretty much nothing happens. It's just her thoughts and memories, and kind of she's sort of looking at really uncomfortable realities of her life and of life in general. And a lot of people said that, a critique that I heard for that book was that it was too uncomfortable, and that a reader would have to put it down. Even like one of my students told me, she was like, "I don't mean to insult you, but like I almost couldn't read it. Like that it was just uncomfortable. If it hits you at the wrong time or the right time, it's kind of an unsettling book." And I think I'm fine with that. That's kind of like, at least for me, it ended up, I think that's both a thing that works about that book, and it's also its flaw, And I do think that in any book or film or work of art or human being, whatever your greatest virtue is, it's attached to your vice. And I think that if you're thinking about things that are real, then you're also thinking about things that are difficult. And I don't want to provide books for the public that are just a real reassuring pat on the back. I just think we have enough of that already. So that for me is part of my goal.
And Alice, this quote that from you, I actually saw it on a bag. Someone was carrying a bag in New York City, and it said, "Books are the only real true magic, Alice Hoffman." And I was like, oh, I know Alice. So talk to me why you think books are the only true magic.
Well, I think when I was growing up, I felt like I was being lied to a lot. Not just by the people in my family, the people around me, but also by the books that I read, which felt like they were speaking down to me. And the only truth that I really found were in fairy tales. And I still feel that fairy tales are the most psychologically true, right-on stories, that they get to a very deep, scary, frightening place. Even though they have nothing to do with reality, that they're fantasy, they go to such a deep, real, psychological place. So I think that's why I always felt in my life books were magic. That was the thing that transported me. And as a writer, that's the thing that continues to transport me.
Okay, so let's talk about the inspiration, the seeds of ideas. And Catherine, I think I'm going to start with you because I did read that book and that voice. Where did the character develop? And maybe you should talk a little bit about this character from your last book. How did that person come to you?
Well, at the time, I didn't want to write novels. I thought I was trying to write nonfiction, and so I had gone to New Zealand purportedly to research organic farming and biodynamics, and I was working on farms and kind of hitchhiking around. And but I did at that time. I wrote and I still write a lot of short fiction. And so I would kind of write a story that was kind of set somewhere in New Zealand because it was just what I was around, and I was by myself and I didn't have anything else to do. So I had, over the time that I was there, supposedly researching something I never wrote a word about, I wrote all these like short stories, and then eventually they kind of all started to grow together, and I thought, this story is too long, I don't know what to do with it. And then maybe a year later or something, I was still writing this voice. And I wrote, the woman that is wandering through New Zealand, she abruptly left her husband. She she just ghosted on her whole life. She didn't tell her job she was leaving, and she didn't tell her husband where she was going. She just vanished. And so I knew that eventually at some point in writing these short pieces of fiction that this was a person that had kind of gone off the rails in a way that maybe we all think about doing sometimes, but nobody's ever actually going to do, or very few people. Some do, it's true. But nobody I know firsthand. So eventually I wrote this in writing these short pieces, and I just couldn't stop doing it. I wrote it was like a letter to him, to her husband, that she had left, about why she had left, and this voice kind of grew out of that had its own sort of energy and rhythm, and it was clear, and it was very easy to write. Once I started writing it, it was just water, you know? And then that voice basically dictated the rest of the book, and I wrote it very quickly after that. So that was sort of the project.
Samantha, your book, Mr. Splitfoot, has a lot of internal dialogue, too. One of your characters stops speaking, and you get to spend a lot of time in the head. Talk to me about those characters and how they came to you.
Great. Okay, so the silent woman was something that I've always been interested in. I'm sorry, those of you who were here yesterday, but I told a story about my great-grandmother, and she stopped speaking after her first child died. She lost her voice, and she never got it back her whole life. So that idea of the silent woman was always something so interesting to me. And, I mean, mixing that with an idea of the utter noise that technology makes in our life now. So I have these two women, one who doesn't speak, walking across New York State, and the one who does speak drops her cell phone within the first 3 days of the walk. You know, I was like, get rid of it, you know, and how can you experience...
You get to do that in fiction.
Yeah, right, I know. I want to do it in real life, but I'm too scared. So that's how that character came to me. The major inspiration was the idea of the split in general, and feeling internally just like, oh yeah, sometimes I totally believe in all these things we're talking about, ghosts and dead people, and sometimes I totally don't believe and I think it's all a hoax. And I wanted to have that split. It is told, it's 2 books and it's told back and forth, and I wanted to be able to have that argument. And so I went into it, I started going to a lot of mediums and a lot of spiritualists, and I went to them with this idea of like, you're all full of hooey. And I have to say that still is half of my mind, but the other half is totally and completely convinced in it. The switch happened. I had this super crazy thing. It happened. I had all of my children and my husband in the car, and one of our daughters was only 3 years old, and she couldn't read yet. And we stopped at a light, and there was a roadside memorial that said Billy. She couldn't read. My other daughter said, Mom, what's that? And I was like, oh. And the little 3-year-old said, that's where William died. And I was like, you know, and it was funny because as I started telling this story to people, kind of saying like, tell me how this happened, you know, tell me how this happened. A good friend of mine who's a biochemist, she was like, well, clearly, you know, clearly someone told her about it or was driving her around. I was like, yeah, because I just give my 3-year-old to random people. And then she said, or maybe she read it in the newspaper. I was like, you are the only magical thinker here right now at all, you know. I was like, and so I became obsessed with that idea of like strange things happen all the time, and what do we do with them? Why do we try to explain them away? Why don't we just let the unknown be? There it is, the unknown.
Alice, you know, it's hard when someone's got like over how many, 30 books?
I think so.
Right. To pick one of those voices but let's talk about Faithful and the voices there, and how did that story come to you?
Well, I think I usually start a book with a question, like I have a question, and I don't know what the answer is.
Okay.
And I'm writing the book to really find out what the answer is. What Samantha said about the silent woman is really interesting to me, because very often I'm interested in women who can't tell their own stories for one reason or another, whether it's a historical novel or a modern novel. So in Faithful, I think my question was, I'm a survivor, I'm a breast cancer survivor, but I feel like I've always been writing about survivorship. And my question was, how do people survive tragedy and trauma in their lives? And I think that's always the question that I'm asking, but definitely in Faithful, that's what I wanted to know. So that's what I started out with, and that's what I wanted to find out about.
And the character who's in the coma. I mean, it doesn't even...
Well, there's a survivor. There are two friends, and one
right.
survives, one's in a coma.
Right.
But it's the question of survivorship in all its forms that's so interesting to me, because I just don't understand how people get through their lives. I mean, everyone is going to lose everyone sooner or later. And so it's a way of thinking about, how do we do that, and how do we live our lives with grace and come to terms with that.
And pay attention to the other signs that maybe there's more. I just kind of went off into a place. Talk to me, Alice, and I want to ask this. Can one be taught to write? I mean, is it something that, you make a decision and then you hone your craft, or is one born a writer?
I think you can be taught to write.
You do?
I mean, I'm a big believer in MFA programs and writers' workshops. I do think you can be taught to write. I think you can teach yourself to do it by certain formats. Like, I really believe that you write if you write. So if you write every day, you're more likely to keep on writing. I don't think you can teach talent, but I think you can teach writing.
Right.
And so, can you teach someone to be a great writer? Can you teach someone to be Toni Morrison? I don't know. But you can definitely teach someone how to write a novel, and it may actually be a good novel.
Catherine, what do you think?
I mean, you could teach somebody to be Toni Morrison, but we already have a Toni Morrison. So we don't need another Toni Morrison. And maybe that's part of the problem, is that a lot of the way that you learn how to write is through intense reading and a love of reading. And that's really like step one. And then it's just having enough initiative to continue to be curious about the world. So you wander around and you see things and you have a rich internal life. And then maybe the way that you want to make sense of it all is through language. But I don't think it's necessarily important to, I don't think it's important to be a writer. I think that it's maybe more important that you are spending your day doing something that is continually interesting to you and kind of keeps you awake and curious and not bogged down by all the things on the planet that could bog you down. And I think sometimes people think that they want to be writers, but actually they just want to be curious and paying attention. And whether that produces writing or not is kind of irrelevant. I think it's probably just better to be a good person.
That's always good to be a good person. I totally agree.
I know you can learn how to write because I look at notebooks that I kept when I was 20 years old, and I'm like, oh my God. And so I know I've gotten better. I don't cringe when I read my own writing all the time now. I mean, there's a little cringe, but yeah, definitely. I mean, and I think most of the work is in teaching yourself, and I think that's achieved through reading a lot. And through, a little bit back to the idea of getting quiet around you so that you can think, because writing is thinking and thinking is writing to me. That's very much how I experience writing. And so if you can have that quiet, and you can stop letting the outside world in, then, that's thinking, and that's how writing happens, at least for me.
And then how about the environment? And does that, because I think for me that also plays such a role in when I read, that the environment is the character, in almost the overlaying character sometimes in environments. How much, Alice, especially with you in historical fiction, do you need to go to that place to really harvest those kind of the feelings, the smells, the tastes, the color? Does that help, especially in looking back at, like, the Dove Keepers?
Yeah, it helps in some ways, but I was really lucky. I had a great professor who told us when beginning writers are being told, write what you know, he told us, write what you can imagine. And he had a student who became a famous writer, John Hawkes, who wrote a book about London, and he told us that he had never been to London. And that was extremely freeing to me. I felt like I could write about things that I hadn't been there, but I could imagine it. So, for instance, I wrote a book called The Marriage of Opposites, which takes place in St. Thomas. And I didn't go to St. Thomas before writing the book because the book wasn't set in the past, and I didn't want the present St. Thomas, which is nothing at all like the past. And when the book was done, and I felt like, I still got St. Thomas. I heard from people who grew up there that it felt like their childhood. And then when I went to St. Thomas, with you, as a matter of fact, and I just felt so lucky that I hadn't been there before I wrote the book, because it wasn't the world that I was writing about.
It was still pretty incredible to be in that synagogue.
Yeah, we did. We went to the synagogue.
Sand floors, and it was one of the highlights of any travel I've ever done. To be in that place was beautiful, and definitely invoked. And I was so grateful for the book because I felt that I had been there before, even though you had never been there before.
Right. I felt the same way. I felt like I was stepping into my book, which was really kind of an amazing thing.
And travel seems to play a lot, Samantha, in your book and in Catherine's book. Talk about that, the idea of travel. It's almost like you have to travel in order to be able to write.
Well, I was saying how thinking is writing. I also think that walking is thinking is writing. And so that long walk is very much a process of slowing down, observation. I mean, it's just a matter of giving you time to observe the world, to hear the world, so that you can think about the world and portray it in a true way. I am a person who loves doing research, and so I do tons of research, and I love to submerge myself in the locations. For Mr. Splitfoot, I was investigating a lot of the religions in upstate New York, so I went to the Mormon pageant at Hill Cumorah. I went to Lilydale, where everybody talks to the dead all the time, and went to the Oneida community, went all over and submerged myself. My problem is that I don't want to stop doing the research and start the writing. When I was writing about Nikola Tesla, I went and stayed and lived at the Hotel New Yorker, and where he'd spent the last 10 years of his life. And I love doing that, but then I have to kind of be like, oh, write it? Oh, and that's always a painful transition to move from the travel and the research to the writing for me.
And Catherine, New Zealand played a big part in your first book.
Yeah, although not the way that I thought. Like I went there to research something that I didn't end up writing about at all. And I mean, I'm kind of like Alice. I think you can write about somewhere you've never been before. But sometimes you don't really get, at least for me, I don't really get to choose. Like sometimes you can apply for, travel grants or whatever as a writer. And every time I'm writing one of these, I mean, I never get them, because when I'm writing these applications saying like, oh, I really need to come to this place or go to this place in order to make this book that doesn't exist somehow, I don't believe it. I'm sitting there writing this and I'm like, this is a lie. And then I send it off and they say, you lied, you don't get this.
And you're not coming because you're lying.
Right, exactly. But I think the kind of first and last word for me when it comes to the relationship between writing and traveling is Elizabeth Hardwick, I think in Sleepless Nights, wrote, the first thing you learn when you travel is that you don't exist. And I think that's always a good place for a writer to kind of begin from, is not that your experience is really important, but that there's a greater experience that's out there that you can hopefully be a kind of a crucible for.
So interesting. How often does having other voices, so your character to give you voice of things that maybe you'd like to be, or perhaps you don't have, with our lives we have obligations, children, the things to do, but your characters take on. Does the character give you courage to speak in a way that you wouldn't normally speak? Almost like acting?
I think it is somewhat like that. I mean, for me, I don't feel that my characters are me. I feel that I don't write autobiographical fiction. I'm not interested in my own life. I'm interested in another life and getting to another place. So for me, the characters speak for themselves, really.
So they're almost outside of you then, Alice? Okay. How about you, Catherine?
I think sometimes I write characters that I feel very close to that are maybe some aspect of my personality, maybe like exaggerated so that it creates problems. But I think for the most part, it is a little bit escapist. I mean, it also is a bit like acting. I grew up in doing a lot of community theater in my little Mississippi hometown, and when I became a teenager and was doing like monologues and auditioning for camps and whatever roles and whatever, I was always really dissatisfied with the monologues that were in these stupid monologue books. And so I wanted to write my own, and that was kind of the first time I started to write fiction, was as like a little kid, just dissatisfied with as a young actress, dissatisfied with the roles
You
that Hollywood was
flip your
providing for
hair
me.
when you say that.
But yeah, I think that there's a big relationship between acting and writing, at least for me. I mean, I'm not an actor at all, and yeah, never really made a serious go of it outside of community theater, but yeah.
Samantha, I was thinking when I was reading Mr. Splitfoot, it's like a mother with young children, the idea of just walking and walking and walking.
Yeah. Oh,
Was that a
lot
little
of that
fantasy
was
going on there?
Total fantasy, because I was saying yesterday I was so pregnant when I was writing this book that I actually couldn't really even make it to the end of my driveway. And so I think it was really armchair traveling. I mean, I only wanted to go like 2 miles down the road, but I was like, 2 miles down the road from here would be great. You know, I was really pretty immobilized with the twin pregnancy. I couldn't move much. The other thing I want to say about this is that I create a lot of really heinous, evil characters, and I enjoy doing that. And I don't know if it's like a purging of fear onto the page, or like a demonstration of imagination. That if I write this awful, awful character, I'm somehow like protected from it, or
Yeah.
I don't know what that is, but I do enjoy creating really evil, awful characters. I had a teacher when I was so young who made us do a writing exercise where he said, write from the absolute other, the worst possible person that you can imagine. And I think that always stuck with me, that idea of like, okay, let's make the worst.
Right. Speaking of which, what's the most outrageous thing one of your readers has made the assumption about you, coming up to you? I often hear that, like, oh, I love her, but she's so crazy. And I'm like, but it's fiction. Alice, has anybody ever come up to you with some outrageous thing like, I didn't know, or, yeah, I agree, I feel that? No?
No, really not. Not. I mean, I think my readers are very sane.
Oh, okay.
And no one's ever, said, I couldn't believe this character did this, or I didn't. No one's ever said anything like that to me.
Oh, I was hoping for something good, Alice.
I'm sorry. But I have to say, I don't think I could stay in the mind of an evil character.
Right.
I mean, I think even I have some characters who I've disliked at the beginning of writing them. By the end, if I haven't somehow fallen in love with them in some way, I can't spend every day with them. I think it's a really personal thing, but that's just for me, because I feel like in my real life I have those other people, and I don't
Enough of them.
Yeah.
Catherine, how about you? I am sure you've had some. I know you must have.
I get a lot of weirdos. I got a written letter from a man in the UK that he mailed it to my publisher in the UK, and then they mailed it to me. And it was an apology on behalf of the entire world for my sadness.
Oh. I knew it was going to be good.
And I like the character in the book, the character in the first one, she's very troubled. And
Yes.
it's like, I don't know if anybody's read any Thomas Bernhard or something. She's kind of in her head in this kind of claustrophobic way. But like that character in that book could not show up and write a book. She's not, it's just not the same.
She's not capable. Right.
And I found this to be, I'm not certain of this, but I have this feeling like it's more often that if you're a woman and you write a female character that everyone thinks it's you, and we let male authors write male characters, and they don't have to be them. I've just noticed it happening. I'm not totally certain that's what was going on, but I don't know of any. I mean, maybe I would love to hear, but if there was a male writer who had ever gotten a letter from a woman apologizing for his sadness, it just kind of seemed gendered. This moment did.
How about you, Samantha?
When I wrote the Tesla book, Invention of Everything Else, I still get a lot of crazy mail. And I think it's partly that people interested in Tesla are a little bit beyond supernatural, let's use that term. And so I get a lot of that, and I get a lot of anger that me, little lady, would take on Tesla as if, how can you understand the great man's ideas? So I do get a lot of that. One positive thing that happened along this is that in my first book, The Seas, I never named the town that I was writing about. I had a very specific place in mind, and I gave a reading in California, and a gentleman came up to me afterwards, and he said, I know exactly. It's like this horrible, depressed seaside town. He said, I know exactly the town. And he named some place in Alaska, and I've never been to Alaska in my life. And I was like, oh, you got, yes. Oh, how did you? Yeah. But I loved that any town could slip into it and that it was open for.
Bad.
I tell lies. What did you think?
Does it ever feel like or is there a point when you're sitting down and developing the story? And I don't know how that works. Do you sit down and do this, beginning, middle, end? And is there always this I love your thing about survivorship, but is there always a point to it? Do you start with a core of the story, a message that you're hoping to get out into the world? Alice,
For me, it's not a message. I feel like I'm writing for myself to try to get an answer for myself.
Okay.
And if it's an answer for anybody else, great. But it's mostly that I'm writing to find an answer for myself. I don't know how I start. Sometimes I start with an outline. Sometimes I start with an idea. But I tend to write more from emotion than from thought. Okay. I'm not really thinking about it. I'm feeling it. And so I have to kind of keep it in check by making an outline or, having some kind of order.
So just to keep that in structure.
Yeah.
Because it could go off the page.
I'm off.
Catherine, how about you?
I agree with what Alice said earlier about wanting to, you don't have an answer, and so you're looking for an answer, so you're writing with a question. I generally don't even know what the question is for some time, and then generally in the middle of working on a story or a book, the question becomes clear. But I can't do outlines, or then I feel like somebody's telling me what to do. Even if it's just like me from yesterday, I'm like, screw you.
I think Catherine is our feisty writer. Do you notice? She's always breaking the rules. Don't tell me what to do. Samantha?
For me, the way I write is, it's very much like feel like a garbage collector, where I'm like, okay, I got that, and I like that. So for Mr. Splitfoot, it was like the problem of moms. Okay, that's one thing I need to talk about or think about. Walking, the silent woman, ghost stories. I had one ghost story in mind that I'd had on a record when I was a little girl that I'd probably listened to 5,000 times, and so it was definitely in my body. So that story was there, and I take 6 or 7 things and try to figure out how they work together. So there's never a message from the start. And I guess part of that is unpacking it, finding out what the message is, or even what the question is, as you were saying. I think if I knew in advance, I'd be like, who wants to write that book? That's boring. That book's already written.
Discovery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing as a writer as it is when you're a reader. Like, you want to get to the end of the story to find out what happened.
Right.
And I think it's true for writers, too. You want to get to the end of the story to find out what happened.
Although your mother always read the last page.
My mother read the last page of every novel before she read the novel.
Isn't that unbelievable? Yeah.
Strange training for me.
No wonder you don't write evil characters. That is demented.
Right.
I wanted to make sure she was going to like it.
I think maybe we could, Theron, is it time to open up to some questions? Yeah. Oh, it's so much fun. I don't actually want to turn it over, but I'll be... Okay. So does anyone have any questions? Sure.
Hi, thank you. Samantha, this is for you.
Yes.
Have you experienced the presence of a ghost in your book, of yourself?
In my life?
Yes.
I have not in myself, but I'll tell you one ghost story that is a Nantucket ghost story. So one of my sisters used to live...
Let's turn the lights down.
Yeah. It was a dark and stormy night. One of my novels does start, it was a dark and stormy night. One of my sisters used to live in the old Mariah Mitchell building that they tore down. And I was out there in the winter with a friend of mine, and we were sleeping in twin beds, side by side. And in the middle of the night, I woke up, and I don't know why I woke up very suddenly, And I had a very peaceful feeling. 2 seconds later, my friend beside me in bed woke up screaming that there was something bad covering her. And I was like, oh, okay. I don't know, 20 years old or so, and I really wanted to go get my big sister and be like, ah. It was pretty creepy, but
you felt very peaceful.
I woke, but
Did
and
you
I
feel
also
guilty for that? Like maybe you caused it?
No, I think I was giving her my evil characters.
She's now blaming Samantha for the ghost.
I gave her my evil characters. No, I mean, I felt like it had something to do with where she was at in her life and where I was at in my life, and that we had a different interpretation of whatever this thing was that came. But I do think I've always thought it's strange that I woke up 2 seconds right before she did. And what was it? I mean, it was a perfectly still, calm night. So there was that. And then, I mean, that experience that my daughter had was undeniable to me. I have no question that happened. And my husband, who's a total skeptic, was there, and he has no question that it happened. So I just feel like, okay.
I remember reading once that children, and this is not a religious kind of thing, but it's a spiritual thing, that children and old people are closer to God, so that they have that ability to just see and to feel things and to know things that we don't, because we get caught so much. And I love that explanation. I love that.
So I'd say I don't know if I believe in it, but I definitely believe in people who believe in it.
Right.
My grandma saw ghosts at the end of her bed her entire life. And she wasn't lying to me, you know.
Right. Any other questions? Sure.
This is a question for Catherine. Catherine, you mentioned you were talking about traveling, and you were saying that sometimes traveling can bring you experiences that you could be a crucible for.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that. That was interesting.
I just think there's something that happens when you're somewhere you don't know, and even just kind of how, I mean, you run the risk a little bit of fetishizing a place just for being somewhere that is not where you're from. Like I was in Japan recently, a few months ago, and doing a lot of walking, and in like a kind of remote area, and just like, you know, the street signs look so different and the buildings look a bit different, but really they're just buildings and street signs, but you're seeing it slightly differently, and you're kind of, you can sometimes just be, I don't know, just sort of recognize the way that the world is put together, the same pretty much everywhere, but that there's something kind of marvelous in these just simple things that we don't see when we walk the same route every single day and see the same people, and you don't kind of hear how just sort of spectacular people can be just waiting on the bus, and things that seem boring or just that you overlook in your regular life, you can see them again, you know? And then when you get back to wherever you're from, you can kind of see that place again. And then you're kind of constantly in a state of I mean, the more you travel, I feel like, or the times in my life when I've have a year where I've traveled a bunch, it seems like 6 years happened in 1 year. And it's partially because I was in this constant state of upheaval. And I don't know. I mean, that can age you faster in some ways, but also it can kind of slow your life down and kind of expand everything. And I like writing and reading and just living from that place as much as I can. Yeah.
Have any of you ever had an opportunity to exchange how you go about your craft as writers in talking to the scientists going about the business of doing science? Because what I've heard are some of the same processes are engaged when you're talking about writing fiction. And it doesn't immediately come logically to mind, but there is some overlap, considerable overlap.
I work really directly with a physicist. Her name is Agnieszka Moshi, and she works at the Brookhaven Lab. We both teach at Pratt Institute, and she's a particle scientist, and she's really interested in where art, writing, fashion even, where it meets the work that she does. And so she engages a couple of us, and we've done a couple field trips out to Brookhaven, and all responding to it in our own way, and then coming together and talking about that And she's amazing. I mean, she's just, her border-free thinking about art and science, it's exactly what I crave all the time.
Does writer's block actually exist, and if so, how do you deal with it?
Well, I didn't believe in writer's block until I had it. I got it after 9/11 when I felt like I couldn't write and I felt like there was no point to anything. I've actually had it recently too, I have to say, after last November. But anyway, when I had writer's block, I didn't know what to do, but I just instinctively did the right thing, which was I went back to read a writer that I loved when I was a child, which is Ray Bradbury, and I read Fahrenheit 451, which is about a society in which books are so dangerous that they're burned, and that there are people who care so much about books they become the book. And it made me remember that storytelling was really important, even in a time when it seemed like the whole world was falling apart. And because of that, I was able to write again. I wrote a book for young adults called Green Angel about a girl who kind of writes her way back to life after a terrible tragedy. So now I believe in writer's block.
Oh, I think it's fine not to write. Sometimes, like sometimes I don't feel like writing, or I don't feel inspired, or you feel overwhelmed by political disasters or whatever it is, and you just don't write. That's fine.
Yeah, I think that you need to think more about like those times as filling up. And then you empty it out, and you fill it up, and you empty it out. Because there's definitely times that I can't write, like right now. I mean, and I'm thinking a lot right now. And if I forced it, I don't know that all that important thinking would be happening for the next book.
It's funny because I feel like when I don't write, I'm in terrible pain. I'm in agony. So if I can't write, and if I have writer's block, or if I'm in a personal situation where I can't write, it's horrible for me.
Well, I'm always taking notes. I'm always thinking, but sometimes it doesn't feel very productive. And I think or sometimes you're trying to, like, you can get kind of blocked with an actual product. If you have a novel going, and then you're just like, I don't know. At least for me, I'll have times where nothing is really moving, and then it's probably time to take a walk or something. But it always comes back. I think it can always come back,
Any other questions? Sure. Hi.
Okay, now this is like pure magic. So I'd never heard of him. I was never taught him in school, never heard his name ever. And when I was maybe, maybe 30 or so, I went to an exhibit at the Neuberger Museum at SUNY Purchase. And the exhibit there was something about James Joyce's movie theater, which was called Cinema Volta. And I thought, that's funny. I didn't know James Joyce had a movie theater. I'm going to make a note to look that up when I get home. And somewhere on the train ride home, I transcribed Volta to Tesla. And I went home and I looked up Tesla instead of Volta. And so his name was in my head somehow. And I hate to say, it's probably from that hair metal band, Tesla. That's probably how it got in my head. I don't hate to say it. I mean, they love the man too, right? They celebrate him all the time. But that's probably how I ultimately... And then when I opened up that jar of learning about him, I could not believe I'd never heard of him. And so at first thing I was like, oh my gosh, this is the man who really invented radio. Oh my gosh, this is the man who's responsible for our modern electrical system. And then the third thing I learned was that when he was 9 years old, he made a motor that was powered by June beetles. And I was like, writing a novel about him now. Right. I couldn't believe I'd never heard of him my whole entire life. So that's how it happened.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed every minute of it.
Thank you.